thank you all for being here this afternoon. While we wait for more people to enter the program, I'll just start with a little housekeeping. The structure of this event will first be introductions, then a program with Anders Morley, and lastly, we'll have time to take any questions and comments. If you have any technical difficulties, feel free to type in your concern in the chat box and I'll assist you there. And to ask a question or make a comment, feel free to press that raise hand button to be unmuted, or you can write it in the chat box or that Q&A box, and I will ask your questions for our author, and we'll address them all at the appropriate time. Let me first introduce you to our author. A dual citizen of the US and Canada, Anders Morley grew up in New Hampshire and began skiing at age 5. After earning a master's degree from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, he settled in Italy, where he worked as a translator and English teacher and explored the Alps in his free time. He contributes regularly to New Hampshire Magazine, and his work has appeared in a variety of other publications, including the Globe and Mail, Northern Woodlands Magazine, Maisonneuve Magazine, and the Aurorian. Am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Morley lives in northern New Hampshire and Italy. This Land of Snow, Anders Morley's book here, received the 2021 National Outdoor Book Award in the Journeys category. Every journey begins with a single step, or in Anders Morley's case, the shush of cross-country skis. For as long as he could remember, Morley dreamed of taking a very long walk. In his 30s, happily married and living in a faraway country, but pining for the silent and snowy winters of his New Hampshire home, he decided to unite his old dream with his equally long-standing love of winter. 14 months later, just as the snow was starting to fall, he set off alone to spend the 4 coldest months of the year traveling on skis across the half-wild country of northwestern Canada. Please welcome Anders Morley and his book, This Land of Snow.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you for the chance to be here in Santa Fe. This is my second attempt. I don't know if some of you were here for my first attempt, but it was kind of a disaster and it didn't happen. So thank you if you're here for a second time. And I'm glad that we were able to make things work. So I am here, as Jessica said, to talk about my book, This Land of Snow. And to give kind of a brief description, the book tells the story of a winter, a whole winter that I spent living outside and traveling across a landscape, and that landscape was northwestern Canada. And the journey took place in the winter of 2012 and 13, so a few years ago now, but it took me a while to get the book out. But my idea in writing a book was to tell a story that was more than just an adventure story. I didn't want, to begin things the moment my feet hit the ground and then end them the moment I went home from this adventure. I wanted to write a story that might appeal to people who were not themselves cross-country skiers, or perhaps not even particularly adventurous. So I think something that had appeal to the kinds of people that read, travel writing, armchair travel writing readers. And so one of the things that I did to try to make the story appeal to that kind of audience and to make it more interesting for myself was to put the events in the context of my life. So to try to think about how and why I decided to take this journey, and then to talk a bit about the effects that it had on my life beyond the central events. And then also I wanted to use the story as an opportunity to look at a few things that interested me, and those were winter as an ecological phenomenon and winter as a cultural phenomenon, I guess you might say, how we as a species relate to winter. And then I wanted to think also about how we move across our landscapes, and depending on the season. And of course, in this season was winter. And so I attempted in writing the book to weave all of these things together into some kind of a cohesive narrative that I thought might be enjoyable to read. So I hope that I've achieved that. And of course, if you ever read the book, you will be the judges of that. And so that's kind of my overview. Now, what I'd like to do this evening is, or this afternoon, I guess where you are, is first talk a bit about the background of the journey, how and why it occurred to me to do this thing that a lot of people thought was crazy. And then I'm going to kind of take you along the trail with me and show you some images as I talk. And then I'm going to stop at 2 or 3 points and read a few passages from the book just to give you a taste of what it's like. So at this point, I'm going to jump over to sharing my screen. So bear with me for just a second. Okay, there we go. Okay. And we're going to get going. So one of the things that I had to think about when I sat down to start writing the story of the journey was, where am I going to start? And I came up with a few answers. And one of those answers was with Tony Matt. Tony Matt is the man you see on your screen right now. He was an Austrian ski racer in the 1930s. In 1938, when the Germans annexed Austria, Tony Matt fled the country with a number of other prominent Austrian alpine skiers, ski instructors, and ski racers. And altogether, they landed in a little town in the White Mountains of New Hampshire called North Conway. North Conway is kind of a major ski center in the Northeast. And when they got there, they founded what, as far as I know, was the first alpine ski school in North America. But Tony Matt is best remembered today, not as a ski instructor, but for his feats in ski racing, and one in particular, at least in New England. He ran in a race in 1939, which is called the American Inferno. The American Inferno was held on Mount Washington, which you see in this picture. Mount Washington is the highest mountain in New Hampshire and in the Northeast more generally. And the course went from the summit down what's called the summit cone, and then into that kind of bowl that you see at the middle of the picture, which is a glacial cirque called Tuckerman Ravine. In Tuckerman Ravine, the way that it's configured, it has this head wall at the top as you drop down into the cirque, which is basically vertical. And then from there, the course went down out the bottom of the ravine and into the woods, the rest of the course down to the valley. And so altogether it was 4 miles. So Tony Matt managed to split the existing record in half. It was something like 13.5 minutes was the pre-existing record. After Tony Matt ran the race, it was 6 minutes and 29 seconds. One of the reasons that he was able to do this was that his plan had been to slow down by doing a few turns before going into Tuckerman Ravine, but he miscalculated, never having skied here before, and just ended up shoosing over the head wall straight down Tuckerman Ravine, where he's thought to have touched 90 miles an hour, and then out the bottom of the ravine and into the woods and down to the bottom of the mountain a few minutes later. This was a story that I heard a lot as a kid. My dad loved to tell it. He would tell it over and over again. And in his version, Tony Matt came tearing down the mountain. And when he got to the parking lot at the bottom, he was so shaken up that he just kind of ignored the crowds that were cheering for him and took his skis off, walked over to his car and put them down in front of his car and drove over them, snapped them in half, and drove off into the sunset and never skied again. And so the story was, again, one that I'd heard a lot, and it was very memorable. It had this dramatic ending that stuck with me. And when I came to write my own book, I realized that it had this psychological insight in it, that sometimes it's possible to take our passions a little bit too far. Excuse me, got a hiccup. And anyway, this idea that it's possible to take our passions a bit too far is an idea that's certainly in my book, and so it seemed like a good frame story to use. Now, I started downhill skiing at first when I was 5 years old, and it was another 5 years before I took up cross-country skiing. And cross-country skiing was something that I discovered really almost by accident. I found a pair of old cross-country skis in my parents' basement, took them out, dusted them off, and found that the boots fit on my feet, and made off into the woods. And from there, the rest is history. That was really my approach to cross-country skiing. Hasn't really evolved much beyond that. I guess that the size of the undertakings has grown, but really for me, it's still just about skiing around in the woods, exploring the winter landscape. Now we're gonna have to get this story moving, and to do so, I'm gonna have to fast forward about 20 years. And when I was in graduate school, for what I was working on, I needed to learn to read German. And so I decided that the best way to do that would be to go to Germany for a few months and take an intensive language course and just get it over with. But while I was there, I met the woman you see in the picture, and she was in the same language course, but she had come from Italy. And her name was Elena. And to make a long story short, we started dating, fell in love, and a couple of years later, I was living in this town in northern Italy, which is called Bergamo. It's right at the foot of the Alps. You can see the foothills rising in the distance. And I lived there for 7 or 8 years. Elena and I got married somewhere in there. But after these 7 or 8 years of living in the city, I started to experience this creeping sense of anxiety, I don't know exactly why. It wasn't entirely clear. Homesickness was certainly part of it. I missed kind of the quiet and open spaces of northern New England, which is very, very different from busy Italy. I missed winter. But in a more generalized sort of way, I just wasn't entirely happy with the shape that my life had taken. You know, it was very different from what I had thought it would be, say, 8 or 10 years before that, which of course I realize is normal. But at the time, it was causing me a lot of mental stress. And it was in the midst of this sort of existential crisis, I guess, that one day I picked up a copy of the National Geographic magazine at a local newsstand. And when I brought it home, I opened it up and I saw this picture staring back at me. And before I'd even read the caption or knew what the story was about, something about the image itself leapt out and seemed to say to me, this is what you need to be doing. This is the perfect medicine for your malaise. And so it occurred to me suddenly that I could pair my love of cross-country skiing with this long-standing aspiration I had to go on some kind of a long, like a continental scale, self-propelled journey. I could go on a long journey on cross-country skis. And so I started to daydream about this. And soon I hit on the idea of doing it in Canada. I happen to be a dual citizen. My father is Canadian. And so I knew that I could spend as much time as I wanted in Canada. And of course, Canada has lots of space and lots of snow. And so it seemed like the obvious choice. And I started spending more time up in the Alps, ski touring, and thinking of it in terms of planning. I started reading a lot about other people who had explored on skis. One of the most notable of whom is or was Fridtjof Nansen, who is on your screens right now. Nansen had been a hero of mine for quite a while. He's best remembered as an explorer for being the first to cross Greenland in the 1880s, and then in the 1890s he attempted to reach the North Pole. He never quite made it, but he got closer than anyone else had until then. But one of the things I loved best about Nansen was that in his normal life in Norway, he seemed to have kind of a similar approach to skiing as I had. And that was that it was just a way of moving around in the winter time when there was snow on the ground. Instead of walking in the winter, he skied. And so Nansen became kind of this guiding light for me. So anyway, I was thinking, this daydreaming turned into planning, practical logistical, thinking about logistical questions like, what route would I take across Canada? Which direction would I travel? What equipment would I carry? And so forth. The problem with all this was that this whole conversation, so to speak, was happening entirely inside my own head. And as you may remember, I had become a married man several years before. And so generally when one is considering embarking on a long expedition in a remote and potentially dangerous place, one should discuss it first with one's spouse. But for whatever reason, and I still don't exactly know why, but I think I just didn't think of it. I failed to do this. And so when one day, about 4 months after I had started thinking pretty serious about this, I kind of casually brought it up in conversation with my wife, not thinking that I was like dropping a bomb, but that's the way it happened. My wife, first of all, was upset that I had essentially just announced to her that I intended to do this, to make this pretty drastic move. And then secondly, she just couldn't understand how any sane person could possibly think of doing something like this. She doesn't care for winter, for one thing. She's not an especially outdoorsy person. And so this just seemed like something wildly dangerous and stupid. And so she was very upset and resisted, to put it mildly, my wishes, I guess you might say. And so this became sort of a source of tension, to say the least. But neither of us backed away from our position. And so over the course of the next year, our marriage kind of went into this downward spiral. But nevertheless, 14 months after that initial conversation, I was in Vancouver here with this pile of stuff ready to head north and then east across Canada. By this time, I was all but certain that I was not going to be going back to Italy, that this journey, my decision to go on this journey, had spelled the end of my marriage. And now, in fact, the journey itself had become kind of a way of putting some distance between me and my wife. So this story of a marriage in disintegration, or at least what looks like a marriage in disintegration, is also part of the book. It's something that I don't shy away from. I try to be very honest about. I'm not going to talk about it very much this evening, although I will mention it again briefly and then say something about it at the end. But it is there, and it parallels the story of the journey, and I've tried to connect the two in the way that I tell the story. So from Vancouver, I took a series of boat rides north up the Inside Passage along the coast of British Columbia, the channel that runs up among the islands, and then continues up into Southeast Alaska. And I was headed for a little town called Prince Rupert. Prince Rupert is Canada's northernmost Pacific port, and it's just a few miles south of the Alaska Panhandle. And Prince Rupert claims to be the rainiest town on Earth. I imagine other towns make the same claim, but at any rate, when we came into port, the sky opened up and the sun poured through about as much as it does, at least in that part of the world. And that seemed to me like a good omen. Now in Prince Rupert, I didn't expect to find snow. It doesn't really snow much on that northwestern coast, as you may know. So you have to go inland before you find a consistent winter. And it was still quite early in the winter. It was November 15th, I think, or November 15th or 17th, something like that, when I arrived in Prince Rupert. And so my plan was to put my skis and my sled and a few other snow related things on a Greyhound bus and have them freighted inland to the next town to the east, which was called Terrace. It was about 90 miles inland to the next town. And then I would walk to close the distance and be reunited with my things, hoping that by the time I got to this town of Terrace, I would find snow. And in fact, when I walked into town, the first blizzard of the year had just begun, and it snowed about 1.5 feet over the course of a couple of days. And from that point on until the end of my journey in mid-March, I would never again see an unsnow-covered landscape. Now, another thing in Terrace was that by the time I got there, having walked all those miles along the road, I realized that I was carrying much more with me than I wanted to be carrying. And so I spent a couple of days sorting through my equipment and kind of trying to get rid of weight and as much weight and bulk as I could to shrink the load that I had to haul around on my sled. And with that, I was ready to head into the mountains. Now, my first objective was to cross a mountain range called the Kitimat Range, which is itself a sub-range of the Coast Mountains. And the Coast Mountains is just the name that the Canadians give to the Cascade Range. So as soon as you get north of the Washington, British Columbia border, the Cascades become the Coast Mountains. And so the northern reaches of these mountains were what I was going to be crossing. And so from this town of Terrace, where I was starting, I had to go up a river valley, over a pass, and then down another valley to a little village called Telqua, which was about 100 miles to the east. And so this was my first concrete objective. Now, again, it was quite early in the winter and it's pretty mild because we were close to the Pacific. So you can see here, there's plenty of snow, but there's lots of moisture in the air, as you can see, and it was pretty warm by day, above freezing. As you can see in this picture, I'm not wearing a lot of clothing for being in a winter scene. Now, the first 20 miles or so, there was a snowmobile track, which was very handy, made the going much easier. I didn't have to break trails, so that was kind of a nice way to ease into things. And the climbing was pretty gradual at first too, but eventually it steepened a little bit. And after about 3 days, this was what it looked like. Here I'm looking back towards the west, and you can see it was sort of this staircase progression. You would go up and then it would even out for a while, and then up and then even out. Now, this next picture is here as kind of a parenthesis for anyone in the audience who is not a cross-country skier or a backcountry skier or anything like that, because a lot of people don't realize that it's possible to ski uphill. But on a journey like this one, you have to be able to ski uphill, of course. And so what you use are climbing skins. Climbing skins, they were once made of seal skins, which is why they're called climbing skins. But nowadays they're synthetic, and they're basically these pieces of fabric that have a diagonal nap to them, backwards facing diagonal nap. And what that does is it permits you to slide your skis forward. But if there's any backward or downward pressure put on the ski, the fabric bites into the snow and keeps you from sliding back. And so they have this sort of glue that sticks to the bottom of your skis, but it's the kind of glue that doesn't stay on the ski when you take them off. Now, I had two types of climbing skis. I had these short ones here, which would give me enough traction to haul my sled, but I couldn't really climb much with them. And then I had full-length ones that went from the tip to the tail of my ski, and with those you can climb surprisingly steep slopes. And so it was thanks to the climbing skins that eventually I was up in terrain, real mountainous terrain that looked like this. And so here we're approaching the pass, and there's kind of a row of mountains like these ones on my south side, and then there's a mirror image of them on the north, on the left-hand side. And the valley is getting narrower and higher, climbing higher and higher as we approach the pass. Eventually I found myself in higher up on the slope, and there were fewer and fewer trees. And this, of course, deep snow on a fairly steep slope can be a dangerous combination for a snow traveler, because it means that there's a risk there may be risk of avalanche. And of course, I had this 100-pound sled secured to my waist, so an avalanche was the last thing I wanted to have anything to do with. And of course, it was just as I was contemplating this possibility that I heard this boom 500 or 600 yards in front of me, and the whole side of this mountain came sliding down. And of course, scared the daylights out of me. And so I stopped to kind of think about what to do. I decided to dig out my camera, which took me a couple of minutes. But even then, you can see that the snow still has not settled back to the ground. There was this sort of a powder snow explosion that went hundreds of feet into the air. Really impressive. Now, the really scary thing about this was that it was getting very late. It was almost dark. It's hard to see in this picture, but I knew I was going to have to sleep somewhere along the base of this slope. The reason being that to the left was a lake, that big white expanse. But again, it was early in the winter. And so while the lake was frozen, I didn't think that the ice was something that I could trust. So I didn't want to ski out and sleep on the lake, which later in the winter I would have done. So I had to sleep near the base of this slope, part of which had just slid. So that was kind of scary. Really the first time that I seriously questioned the wisdom of what I was doing. But the next day was a horrible slog. I covered about 2 miles. It rained during the day, and the snow, I was up quite high at this point, and the snow was getting deeper and deeper. But the third day after this incident, I finally reached the pass. And I want to actually stop here for a first little reading passage about the moment when I reached the pass. From the look of the sky through the trees, I thought there was a lake to my south. If my hunch was right, I was approaching the high stretch of land between the Bulkley River and the lower Skeena River watersheds. When the trail flattened out, it crossed a broad swath cut to take power lines over the mountains. There were no trees to delineate the trail anymore, and it disappeared. The power line swath, which I might otherwise have followed, went northeast over impassably craggy terrain. So I unhitched my sled and went searching for my onward course. The tops of young trees poking above the surface of the snow gave me the idea that the snow was 8 or 9 feet deep, and it sometimes sloughed down into pockets among the branches if I cut too close to them. Skiing for a few minutes without my sled brought a feeling of sprightliness, reminding me of a fisher I'd seen that morning. I slipped along the swath to a rise with a long view westward so I could check the land against my map. I took off my skis and climbed a transmission tower for a better view. I could see that Top Lake, the last in a series striding the pass, was behind me. It meant I was on the height of land, but it was as though the trail had dead-ended. By skiing east along the south side of the swath, I figured I had to hit the opening of the trail at some point. Clutching this invincible nugget of logic, I darted along the edge of the clearing, still fisher-like, for 10 minutes. It started snowing in lush, unearthly flakes. The silence imbued peace into every shimmering molecule of the hermit universe surrounding me. Amid the hush, suddenly a soundless puff of snow burst at my feet. My heart leapt, startled by the bursting thing. There was something whiter than the enveloping whiteness, levitating higher and higher. The rise morphed into flight. It took me longer than it should have to register what it was, and the ptarmigan made for an opening in the trees as if to show me that the path was there. The bird blended back into the white and was gone. I retrieved my sled, seemingly weightless now, as if I were a ghost transiting the solid world. I pictured myself as the subject of a Chagall painting, an old world skier floating upward to chase a ptarmigan across the white sky, and felt almost at home in the snow. In minutes, I was beyond the pass. And so I made it through the pass, down the other side, and skied off into central British Columbia. Now, this picture is not a great picture, but it's here just for people who are interested in winter camping. It's here to show my sleeping bag, which of course was one of the most important pieces of equipment I had with me. I could go on for a while about it, but I just want to mention two distinctive features of this sleeping bag. One was that it had a double top. Usually sleeping bag has one part on the bottom and one part on the top. So this had two tops, and they were both insulated in goose down. And there were two different thicknesses. And so what that did was it enabled me to use either the thinner of the two tops on its own, if it was, relatively warm, the thicker of the two tops on its own if it was a little bit colder, or both together if it was really cold. And then the other distinctive feature is that you could, there was a zip that went almost all the way around the sleeping bag, which is also unusual. And what that does is it enables you to ventilate in all kinds of ways, which is important because when you're sleeping in a tent night after night in the cold, you want not to sweat to keep the condensation down, because the condensation will eventually turn to ice. Once it gets into all the fabric, ice is almost impossible to get out. Now here, a map. So about 3 weeks into the journey, I realized that at the rate I was going, there was no way I was going to make it all the way across Canada, which had been my initial plan. And so at that point, the focus kind of shifted to the idea of spending the entire winter outside and not being too concerned with where I got. So it became the focus shifted to time rather than space, let's say. But my route, nevertheless, basically was the same for the first, what would have been the first half of the journey. And so this, what you're looking at here, is the journey that I actually made, about halfway across Canada rather than all the way across. And the idea was to straddle the 55th parallel, basically. I saw the 55th parallel as kind of the heart of the Boreal Forest. And the Boreal Forest, for those of you who don't know, is that evergreen ecosystem, northern pines, fir and spruce trees, and then scatterings of birch and poplar here and there. And it's the largest ecosystem in Canada, in central and northern Canada. And also in the old world, it is the ecosystem in which skiing first evolved. And so I like this idea of there being kind of a symbiotic relationship between skiing and this Boreal Forest. As a poetic idea, really, more than anything else. And so that kind of had something to do with why I chose the route that I did. Now, a question that people have asked me now and then was there a route that you were following, a standard route or a trail across this part of Canada? And the answer is no. I had to kind of patch together my own route. And sometimes that meant using trails, ordinary hiking trails, skiing on them, of course. But in northern British Columbia, it also often meant using logging roads. Now, logging roads wend all over thousands of miles. Logging roads wend their way all over British Columbia. And most of them in any given winter are not being used to take out timber. And so no one bothers clearing them. They're just these single lane gravel tracks that lie under a few feet of snow all winter long. And so they're perfect for someone like me who's looking for an easy way to get across the landscape. Now, this is a picture of a logging road too, but it's kind of a major artery. So it's got 2 lanes and a power line running along it, but it was the only visual aid I could find for this point. Another possibility were railroads. And this is something that strikes a lot of people, especially in the East, as unusual. Because railroads we think of like commuter railroads going to Boston or New York or something like that. But in Canada, probably like some places in the West as well, there are railroads in places that are nowhere near any automobile roads. And by nowhere near, I mean, tens, if not 100 or more miles away from the nearest road. The railroads were built, to make the most efficient connections for moving cargo between one town and another. And if there's just a stretch of wilderness between those two places, that's where the railroad goes. And these kinds of railroads would see very little traffic. So here I'm coming into the rail yard in a town called Chetwynd, but usually it was more like this. And I skied for probably a couple hundred miles along railroads in northeastern British Columbia and Alberta. And on these railroads, a train would come by at most once every 24 hours, but sometimes not for 2 or 3 days at a time. And so I think actually this is another passage that might be kind of fun to read. It's not really about the railroad, but it's kind of in this part of the country, approaching Pine Pass. So this is kind of a hard one to set up, but at Christmas, my parents and my wife decided that they wanted to come and find me for a few days, no matter where it was. So they flew to Edmonton and drove 10 hours to this little town called Fort St. James in northern British Columbia, and spent a couple of days with me, and then went back home. And it was kind of a disastrous visit just because my wife and I weren't getting along at the time. But that has nothing to do, doesn't have much to do with this reading, but that's just a sort of a setup. And so then to get back to where I was going to continue skiing, I had to take a bus up to this pass in the Rockies. And so this scene begins at the bus station in a town called Prince George in northern British Columbia. The Prince George coach depot was bedlam. The woman at the ticket counter spoke with a marked southern accent. She was from Georgia. The effect lent something absurd to the grim northern setting. Everyone found her agreeable, even though she was consistently doling out the kind of news that ruined your day. If you're lucky, your luggage might make it tomorrow, or the westbound bus is stuck in a blizzard between here and Edmonton. A young woman ahead of me in line asked for a ticket to Fort St. John. What's your name, dear? Said the sunny Georgia peach. Greenwood, said the other woman. Are y'all kin to Lee? Excuse me? I said, are y'all kin to Lee? You asked me that same thing last time, said the young woman, who was amused. Well, that's just who I think of when I hear the name Greenwood. I don't know who he is. I'll have to Google him. What? Said Georgia. You don't know Lee Greenwood? He's real famous. Oh, what's that song he sings? She looked at the ceiling and rattled her fingertips on the counter. Then the memory clicked and she shouted, God bless the USA, and beamed. Every head in the station turned. The traveling woman stared blankly back at Georgia. I wouldn't know, she said. I'm Canadian through and through. The crowded bus rolled north over the Great Divide, whose greatness is understated in the northern Canadian Rockies. We went through Bear Lake and Mackenzie, where we turned around and went back to the highway to resume our journey northeastward. I'd requested a flag stop at Azazetta Lake in the middle of Pine Pass, the northernmost and lowest road pass over the Rockies. The bus slowed down, and all the other passengers looked around the cabin, wondering why. I walked down the aisle, trying not to blush at all the stares. The driver climbed out in shirt sleeves and helped me take my things from the hold. She stood for a second, shivering and looking at the heap of gear. Are you sure you know what you're getting yourself into? She said. I'm already into it, I said. The bus drove off and I stood alone in the grayness, feeling less than all right. I'd been off the trail for a week and had done nothing to keep myself tough. What am I doing here? Floated again near the surface of my thoughts. I stood in my empty sled to keep my feet off the ground and stripped down to my boxer shorts so I could put on my long underwear. I packed everything onto the sled, put on my skis, hitched the sled to my waist, and drew up onto a snowbank along the side of the road. Things did not go well on the snowbank. I sank up to my knees and was making impossibly slow progress. I moved to the other side of the road, but I had no buoyancy there either. It was snowing and the shoulder had an inch or two of cover, but it was sandy and the going was miserable. Still, it was the only way forward. My frustration gave way to tears quickly. This was a change that had happened on the trail. The more time I spent alone and vulnerable to cold and solitude, the closer my emotions rose to the surface, and the more easily the surface broke. I pushed stubbornly ahead with my eyes locked on the ground, a few steps in front of me. It was strange to think that only the day before I had been with Elena. She could very well be back in Italy by now, strolling with our dog Beowulf under budding linden trees where crocuses pushed up through the soil, our present realities seemed unbridgeably far apart. It was not hard to imagine her 24 hours earlier making me laugh as she quipped with Voltairean mordancy about the pathology of my compulsion to immerse myself in so hostile an environment. Couldn't I just be content to know it existed? It seemed now, as the wind in the past ripped the tears off my cheeks and sent them flying among snowflakes, that she might be right. So I talked about some of the different ways that I was moving across the landscape. Another possibility, once I got further east into Saskatchewan and Manitoba, was on frozen lakes. There are tens of thousands of lakes on the Canadian Shield. And of course, they're all frozen and snow covered. And so they become a very good way of moving across the land. But with all this thinking I was doing about moving across the landscape, my thoughts would sometimes take a poetic or a philosophical turn. And I would think about how much more gracefully other animals seemed to move through winter landscapes. And that was sort of the spirit that motivated this picture of a little mouse track, which had a certain elegance to it, I thought. And what I really love about it is the way that you can see its tail dragging the line behind it in the snow, connecting all the dots of its footprints. This is the Peace River. Peace River was the largest river I skied across, and it flows north and ultimately via the Slave and Mackenzie rivers spills into the Arctic. And so this feeling that I was crossing Arctic bound water gave me a bit of a thrill when I crossed it. In Alberta, I occasionally found myself having to ski down onto sections of open prairie, and made a huge difference being out of the woods. There was a lot of wind to which I was, of course, exposed. And it was January, so it was also the coldest part of the winter. And so some of the coldest moments were spent skiing out on the prairie in northern Alberta. It was also there that I came to the first really big lake that I had to ski across over the course of the winter. I skied across many small lakes, but three big ones. And the first one was this Lesser Slave Lake in Alberta. We're looking here at my camp, some variation of this every night in different settings, of course. And I had a tunnel tent, which tends to be more wind resistant than certain other tent designs. It's divided into two compartments. And in the compartment that's farther from us in this picture is where I slept. And the nearer one, called the vestibule, was where I did my cooking. And the cooking itself was pretty straightforward, but after that, every evening, I still had to keep my stove going for a couple of hours. And I would have to shovel load after load of snow into it, which I would then melt into water and then boil and pour into my thermos, where it would become my water supply for the 24 hours to come. And it was while I was waiting for the water to melt and boil every evening that I would make a detailed account of the day's events in my diary. And then later, of course, when I sat down to write a book, those diaries became very important. Now we've crossed into Saskatchewan, our third province going east. And it was February and the days were getting noticeably longer. And for whatever reason, the second part of the winter was much sunnier than the first part had been. It was still cold, but sunny. And this combination made the snow sparkle and had this wonderful glide to it. And so some of the best, most enjoyable skiing was in those first few days in Saskatchewan. Whenever I was sliding along, I had this guy looking back up at me from the tips of my skis. This is Roald Amundsen, another Norwegian explorer. Amundsen was the first to reach the South Pole. In this picture, he had this very stern look on his face. And so whenever I felt kind of faint-hearted or discouraged, I would just look down at Amundsen and pretend that he was this real guy staring back at me, and that would kind of give me the kick in the pants that I needed to keep moving. We're looking here at the home of a character in the book who, well, I call him the Cossack. That was a nickname that his friends called him. His real name was Don, but he was of Ukrainian and Russian ancestry. a Canadian though. But he was just sort of this Russian, he was this sort of crusty northern character, a dog musher, confirmed bachelor. And anyway, he lived in this log cabin, and he's my favorite character in the book. Highly entertaining individual. And so this is the inside of his house, pretty basic, but it was all he needed. Now, these next few shots are taken on lakes in northern Saskatchewan. This one, I had just come through one of the most harrowing experiences of the winter when I was completely disoriented during a whiteout out in the middle of a pretty large lake. And I was approaching a town called Lac La Ronge, where I had a person holding onto a supply drop for me. And this guy was kind enough to ski out and meet me just sort of as a friendly gesture. And when I saw him, I'd never been so happy to see another human being again, which explains the smile. So here, it's a few shots. These next few shots are of Lac La Ronge. Lac La Ronge was the largest lake that I skied across over the course of the entire winter. It was between 30 and 40 miles across where I crossed it. And this pictures here just kind of give a sense of scale. So you see that black line on the horizon. That's an island, not the mainland. In this picture, as you can see, no land on the horizon. And so in getting across the lake, I had to spend 2 nights out on the ice. And it was quite cold, and the sky was very clear, so that meant cold nights. And there was just the faintest wind, but that faint wind made all the difference. I've always kind of downplayed the importance of wind chill, and I refuse to accept the wind chill factor when it's given as part of the temperature. But on Lac La Ronge, for the first time in my life, I thought, maybe there's something to it. And then here, finally, I am in Manitoba, and I was just leaving a little town in northern Manitoba called Flin Flon. And Flin Flon is a mining town. There's a huge copper mine there. And so the smokestack you see in the background is the smelter of the mine. And this picture was taken by a local newspaper reporter, as was the next one. And this is me skiing south again, out of Flin Flon, into what would be the last 10 days or 2 weeks of the journey. And so at this point, I've finished with my pictures and my talk for the most part, but there are 2 loose ends I quickly want to tie up. And one of them it's a bit of a spoiler, but I like to say it. And that is that the book has a happy ending. My wife and I, after this, the rift that happened as a result of my decision to go on this journey, things continued to spiral downward over the course of the winter and beyond. But eventually, after an unbelievable 5 years of separation, we managed to work through our differences, and my wife forgave me, of course, for my insensitivity and other foolish things I did along the way. So I'd like to say that because sometimes people like to know that there are actually true stories in the world that have happy endings, and this is one of them. So if you like the story with a happy ending, maybe this is the book for you. The other thing, and I just to sort of close the loop here, I began by telling the story of Tony Matt, the Austrian ski racer, or at least my father's version of it. When I decided I wanted to use that story to frame my own, I thought I'd better go and look to make sure I have all the details straight. And so I found the details of the American Inferno, the ski race, Tony Matt's record-breaking time, and all of that was true. But I couldn't find anything about this business of him running over his skis and never skiing again. And so eventually, I wrote to a ski historian at the New England Ski Museum in New Hampshire and asked about this. And so the man who responded to me knew a lot about Tony Matt. And he said, no, I'm absolutely certain that is not the way the story ended. Tony Matt went on to have this long, illustrious ski career. And I'm sorry to have to tell you, but your father just made up his own ending to the story, which is characteristic of my father. But nevertheless, it had this kind of ring of truth to it. There was this insight in the story, and so I decided to tell it anyway. And of course, I explained that that's not really the way things went. And with that, I have finished with my pictures and my talk, and I would love to try to answer any questions that you have.
There's a couple that have come up, but yes, if you have any questions, feel free to write it in the chat or Q&A, or you can raise your hand to be unmuted. So first one I see here is, I'm curious if you encountered any wildlife or perhaps other adventures, the humankind.
Yeah, I encountered wildlife, not as much as you might think, but I think animals are better about seeking shelter in hostile weather than we are. But yeah, I mean, I saw the most, I guess, one of the exciting things was moose. I saw a lot of moose in northeastern British Columbia in particular. One day, in a single day, I saw about 20 moose at one point, which is pretty incredible. I don't think I've seen 20 moose in my life. All the other moose added up. And then a single wolf out in the middle of a lake. He was crossing south to north. I was going west to east. We kind of crossed paths about 60 yards from each other, kind of looked at each other, and he made off in his direction and I in mine. But then there were lots of like ordinary things, snowshoe hares and grouse. But the two most exciting wildlife sightings for me were in that first reading they're both mentioned in that first reading I did with the ptarmigan that kind of burst out of the snow and then flew off into the opening. Ptarmigans, for anyone who might not know, are those kind of partridges that live in high altitudes and high latitudes, and they turn white in the wintertime so that they're camouflaged in the snow. I had never seen one. And then that same day in the morning, I had seen a fisher. And fishers are a medium-sized member of the weasel family. We have fishers in New Hampshire, but they're very shy, and I had never seen one. So that was the first time that I'd ever seen one. So it was kind of exciting too.
Very cool.
Oh, and sorry, the humankind. Yeah, there are lots of, I guess, why you should say, if you consider like, driving around in a truck with a firearm under the influence of alcohol, wild behavior, which I consider fairly wild behavior. I encountered lots of that sort of thing.
Wild indeed. Patricia wrote, did you have food drops along the way? What did you eat?
Yes, I did. So I had food drops. I packed up boxes with 2 weeks worth of food in them, and then maps for the same section, and a book for each section as well. And then those were sent out to little post offices, or in some cases to people who I'd managed to make contact with beforehand, mostly associated with little the cross-country ski clubs. And so they were held for me in various places. And what did I eat? So I had one hot meal a day, and that was my supper. And they were meals that I had dehydrated myself, various combinations of meat, vegetables, and starch, some more appetizing than others. And so I would drop those in my cook pot every evening with some boiling water. And then I had sort of this cozy that I'd made from a reflective windshield screen, several layers thick, so that once I poured the hot water, and I would just put it in there and kind of let it cook on its own to save fuel. And then I always carried a block of butter around with me, and I would chop off a couple of inches of butter and drop that into the pot to boost the calorie count. And then for the other meals, breakfast and lunch, I had high energy, dense foods like energy bars and nuts and dried fruit and chocolate and stuff like that. And I would just kind of stuff my pockets full in the morning and munch as I skied along. And then finally, the third thing, sweet drinks in my thermos, like hot cocoa or lemonade crystals, were another calorie source.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
An interesting question from Jessica. What sounds do you remember from your journey?
That is a very interesting question. And it's the first time I've had that question. Thank you, Jessica. Well, the ever-present sounds are the one that's sort of cracking of snow, the crunch, I guess you might say, as my skis moved ahead through the snow. I mean, depending on the type of snow, obviously not on soft, powdery days. And then the creaking of the shafts that went back to my sled, like and the metal fittings on the sled. So those were the omnipresent sounds. Other sounds, lakes, frozen lakes make some rather interesting sounds, sometimes scary sounds, especially early in the winter when you're not used to them yet. You kind of get used to them. But like sometimes you get like these, it's the sound of sort of air bubbles shifting around under the ice, and they'll make these weird kind of like you know that sound effect that is used in old movie, like in old westerns of gunshots. You could like when you know when you're a kid and you make the telephone with the two tin cans and the rope going between them, and if you like flick the wire, it makes that sort of pow sound. It was kind of like a deeper version of that the ice would make. It's a really weird kind of surreal sound. So that's a distinctive sound that you don't hear in ordinary life. Also cracking of trees when it's cold and sap is freezing. I think that's probably what's making the sound. Other interesting sounds, and the wind, of course, the wind in my ears was a constant on lakes, especially, and flapping nylon in my tent, which became very irritating. And that, interestingly, was a sound that I have loved my whole life, but over the course of the winter, I learned to hate it.
Cassia wrote, did you know you were going to write a book when you set out? Did you keep detailed notes, which you mentioned your diary, or were you mostly recalling the details after the fact?
All right. Yeah, I knew I intended to write a book. I did, yeah, but I think that whatever book I envisaged before the journey was much different from what I ended up writing, just because of the turn that my life took in the meantime. And yeah, so I kept a diary. I was very diligent about writing it, which looking back, I have to say I'm impressed with myself, because it was not a very comfortable thing to do, sit there and write in the cold. But I filled 4 or 5 notebooks over the course of the winter. So quite a bit of detail. Now I wrote then a first draft, which was just sort of a linear description of the journey itself, fairly shortly after the journey, just the following winter. And so, I mean, I relied heavily on the notes from my diary, but at that point, I was still close enough that I remembered quite a bit of stuff that maybe wasn't necessarily in the diary. So fortunately, that part got out early. And then I had to rework the drafts later and to add all this stuff from outside the journey. But of course, that wasn't a matter of remembering details.
Thank you. These two questions go well together.
Mm-hmm.
Asks, are you glad you did this trip? And I think it's Cece who wrote, do you plan to do another journey like this one?
Yeah, are you glad you did this trip? That's a question. Well, the simple answer is yes, but it's kind of complicated. It's one of those things that there are lots of things along the way that you regret and that you wish you had done differently, but on the whole, it's an experience I'm glad I went through, and I think that I became better for it, and it really sort of helped me to sort of cut a lot of the sort of dross out of my life, I guess you might say. So it's something that I certainly have mixed feelings about, but I would say on the whole, yes, I'm glad I went on this journey. And then the second question, whether I have a similar journey or something similar planned for the future. Was that it? Something like that? Nothing, certainly not in the winter.
Yeah. Do you plan to do another journey like this one?
Yeah, I don't have any concrete plans at the moment for something on this scale, like this many months. There is another adventure that I would like to do, I guess you might say, and write about, but probably just for a month or something like that. And I would like to do a journey on foot, in probably in the early fall. That's taken entirely between the hours of sunset and sunrise. So to kind of make myself nocturnal, and walk for a month, and I'd like to write a book about that too. But the book wouldn't be so much about the journey. The journey would just be sort of an experiment in making myself nocturnal, and then I would write about night and night is a cultural, like what night means culturally to us, and there's all sorts of interesting ecological questions, like animals becoming nocturnal to avoid human sprawl and things like that. So that's another project somewhere in the next few years.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I just want to make sure everyone who's attending here knows that we have copies of This Land of Snow available at the library. You can also purchase it online or request it at your local bookstores. And for those of you attending, we'll raffle a number of you off to receive a copy that Anders sent to the library to gift to you guys. So thank you all so much for being here with us for this great program. And a million times thank you, Anders Morley, for providing this program for our patrons and our community far and wide. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Jessica. It's been fun, and thanks to everyone in the audience. And I see some thank you messages popping up in the chat, so thank you all. And I hope you've enjoyed this. And if you read the book, I hope you enjoy the book. It's also, if you're interested, it is available as an audiobook. I don't know if you have Hoopla or some audiobook service at the library. So it's on there, read by a professional book reader, not by me. So it's another option.
Great.
But again, yeah, thanks. And thanks to the Santa Fe Library. Thanks to you, Jessica, for your help in putting this together.
Oh, thank you. And all of you out there, Anders is probably very tired. I imagine it's quite late where you actually are.
I'm practicing for my nocturnalization. Yeah, no, I don't know if you mentioned it. I'm in Italy. So I said I live normally in New Hampshire, but I spent a few months here. And I was expecting to be at home, but I'm still here in Italy. So
We appreciate you staying up late to provide the program.
My pleasure.
Be well, and all my best to you.
Thanks,
everyone. Have a great evening.
Night, everyone. Bye.